Hey guys, my name is Chris Meganbear, and for those of you that don't know me, I'm just another guy on YouTube that's very interested in nutrition. Now, I did just want to get it out there that I'm not a doctor. I'm working towards a degree in nutrition currently. This was actually a project that I had to do for one of my classes, and I figured I would make a video on it because I'm sharing a lot of my experiences here, and I think that it's important for me to share this with people. If you don't think that this qualifies me to speak on this, then feel free to shut the video off. But for those of you that have an open mind and are willing to listen to what I have to say, I urge you to continue to watch this video and you might learn a thing or two. Now, I'm going to comment on a couple things that I would consider very controversial. The current medical establishment refers to what they call the lipid hypothesis, that talks about how cholesterol is essentially a direct cause of cardiovascular disease, coronary artery disease. I am going to talk about how I don't think that cholesterol actually is the cause of these things. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't think that cholesterol is physiologically involved in the formation of arterial plaque or atherosclerosis, but I do believe that we are treating LDL specifically as more of a criminal than a firefighter that's serving a vital purpose, and I did just want to try and make my case for that. So, currently in the medical establishment, we do see that high LDL is considered to be a poor marker of metabolic health. Now, you're going to hear me say that a lot. Okay, there's going to be a lot of things here that I'm going to try and make as simple as possible so that I can bring it down to a level that everyone can understand. So a marker of metabolic health is you get a blood test and you can look at some of your test scores. You can look at your HDL cholesterol. You can look at your LDL cholesterol. You can look at your hemoglobin A1C. There's a ton of different markers that you can look at that show whether or not you are metabolically healthy. And the current medical establishment believes that LDL cholesterol in specific is a marker of metabolic health, and just from the research that I'm about to show you guys, I don't think that's true. So this is one of my favorite things to talk about. I've spent hundreds of hours researching on this. I've been to different conferences. I've heard doctors talk about this. I've seen all these presentations and stuff like that. So I'm going to try and condense all of this into a form that I think people can digest. Is LDL cholesterol really the cause of heart disease? Like I said, I'm not a doctor, but I do believe that I may be able to provide enough proof here to at least make you think twice about this. The first study we're going to look at is called High Ratio of Triglycerides to HDL Cholesterol Predicts Extensive Coronary Disease. These researchers took patients that were considered high risk, 374 of them, and they submitted them for coronary angiography, meaning that they took scans of their heart so that they can see the extent of coronary artery disease, and they compared that to their blood lipid levels and then scored that. So this wasn't just HDL and triglycerides. They also looked at their LDL, they looked at their total cholesterol, and there were some other factors that they looked at as well. Many epidemiological and cohort studies have shown strong association between cholesterol and all of these individual lipid values, total cholesterol, LDL, HDL, and atherosclerosis. Particle sizes of these cholesterol molecules have also been considered. For example, if it's small and dense, it's usually considered more inflammatory, whereas if it's large, it's more buoyant and it's considered protective. Now, the ratio of triglycerides to HDL correlates inversely with plasma levels of small LDL particles. So this is important because if you have small, dense LDL particles that are inflammatory, you can see that that's going to correlate with your triglyceride to HDL levels. Now, this is not commenting on the LDL value, your total LDL. This is simply commenting on the size of your LDL particle. A triglyceride to HDL ratio of 3.8 divides distribution of LDL phenotypes. Now, basically what this means is that if you had a triglyceride to HDL ratio of 3.8, 79% of people with small, dense particles are greater than this value, and 81% of people with large, buoyant, protective HDL or LDL particles are lower than this 3.8. So I'll get more into that. It's a little confusing, but I'll make sure that you understand what I'm saying. Now, if we look at an analysis of the relationship between plasma lipids and development of coronary artery disease, it was found that triglyceride to HDL ratio greater than 4 is the most powerful predictor of coronary artery disease. This is important because we walk into doctors and they see these high LDL numbers, low density lipoprotein, that's considered the bad cholesterol, And immediately they'll put you on a statin because they think that you're going to get heart disease, when in reality LDL cholesterol isn't even the strongest predictor of heart disease when it comes to blood lipids. Triglyceride to HDL is a much more powerful predictor. It's important to remember that I created this presentation for my class and I didn't change it, so it's formatted the same. Part of the assignment was to go through and summarize the different sections of the study. So according to this study, little data exists to show the association between triglyceride to HDL ratio and the extent of severity in coronary artery disease. But this study's from 2008, so I know that there is more studies that have come out since then, and I'll talk about them. So the objective of this study was simply to evaluate the correlation between lipid variables and the extent of coronary artery disease. So they wanted to look at what was the most accurate way when looking at blood lipid values to predict that somebody was going to have coronary artery disease, and then they scanned these people's hearts for coronary artery disease to confirm this. All these risk factors were defined: high total cholesterol, triglycerides, high LDL, low HDL. This is important. We'll talk about this in a second. Elevated triglyceride to HDL ratio greater than 4. It's important to remember that having an elevated triglyceride to HDL ratio greater than 4 is probably the strongest predictor of coronary artery disease development, at least according to the study and a few others. High fasting blood glucose is another one. All of these I would consider markers of metabolic health. So again, I mentioned that earlier, and I'm going to continue to say that. I'll just quickly go over the demographics here. You can see the split between male and female. You can see the age groups, whether or not they experienced hypertension, which is high blood pressure, whether they had high cholesterol, whether they had low HDL cholesterol, whether they had high LDL cholesterol, high triglycerides, a high triglyceride to HDL ratio, diabetes, and smoking. All of these would be considered different metabolic factors that they are measuring. And then the Freisinger index is how they score that coronary angiograph that I was talking about earlier. We'll get more into that. Patients underwent diagnostic coronary angiography for suspected coronary disease. So this is scored based on the 3 main coronary arteries. There's 5 points each and 15 points total. So just to show you guys what I mean by this, you can see that they measured this artery, they measured this artery, and they measured this artery. And they looked at how bad the atherosclerotic formation was in these arteries for these patients compared to their lipid values. So 0 was the best, showed that there was no lesions. 1 was lesions from 1 to 29%, 2 was lesions from 30 to 68%, 3 was the same except there was more narrowing in the same vessel, so that means that there was more closure from a different lesion. 4 showed at least 1 lesion between 69 and 100% closure, and then 5 showed this plus the occlusion of the proximal segment of the vessel. Basically, this just means that there was an actual clogged artery, and this was the worst possible result that you can get. This explains how they scored it, but what's important here is that coronary lesions scored by experts were blinded to patient lipid panels. So these people scored these patients without seeing their lipid panels. So they just scored that. They try to keep it as unbiased as possible. Now these are the results: 374 patients, 60% men, basically 40% women, between the ages of 45 and 68 years old. They looked at their total cholesterol, their triglycerides, their HDL cholesterol, their LDL cholesterol, and their Freisinger index. So this graph compares lipids broken down into quartiles to whether or not the patient had a Freisinger index greater than 5. So as you can see, HDL, triglycerides, and triglyceride to HDL ratio all show a linear trend with the formation of atherosclerosis compared to LDL cholesterol and compared to total cholesterol. If you look at these p-values, 0.0001, 0.0001, 0.0017, compared to these values up here, you can see these numbers are smaller. All that means is that they're much more statistically significant than these values up here. Now, the odds ratios for the extent of coronary disease between the fourth and first quartiles were as follows, and it lists them. I'm not going to reread this, but I did just want to show you a graph that shows this. This is probably the number one thing that I want you guys to get from this specific study, because this is how important this is. If we look at the formation of atherosclerosis and compare it to these lipid values, you can see, look at this. Look at this triglyceride to HDL ratio. It goes almost across the entire spectrum. So it goes almost like it was the number one predictor of coronary artery disease across every possible quartile that could exist compared to HDL on its own, triglycerides, LDL, and total cholesterol. This is extremely important here because we think that this value right here is what's important, but really if you look at this, you can see this is so much more important, and it's such a better predictor. These are just some other graphs that essentially show the same thing. They found that total cholesterol and LDL showed very similar distributions. So we're just looking at this number up here. I'm not going to get too much into the details here, but if you look at these numbers up here, you can see that HDL cholesterol and triglyceride to HDL cholesterol was much more statistically significant at predicting coronary artery disease than triglycerides alone or cholesterol alone. So in this case, they found that increasing HDL quartile led to a 22% decrease in the extent of coronary artery disease, and increasing LDL led to a 23% increase in coronary artery disease, but increasing the triglyceride to HDL ratio led to a 30% increase in disease extent, which proves once again that HDL is a more significant marker of metabolic health than LDL is. So of 246 subjects with low HDL, 69% had extensive coronary artery disease. Of 170 subjects with high triglyceride to HDL, 72% had extensive coronary artery disease. HDL and triglycerides were incongruent in 25% of subjects with low coronary artery disease and 32% with extensive coronary artery disease. But if you take these two values and put them together, you can see that it drastically increased the accuracy of detecting coronary artery disease. Basically, this analysis of ROC curves is essentially they take all of the factors and they combine them together and then they score it based on what they believe is the most accurate way to predict coronary artery disease. And they found that when you look at HDL compared to LDL, you can see that HDL 0.001, highly statistically significant. LDL 0.131, not statistically significant at all. But this is the number that we're treating. This is the number that we're basing treatment off of. And triglyceride to HDL ratio also very highly statistically significant with a 0.001 p-value. So again, a triglyceride to HDL ratio was the most powerful predictor of coronary artery disease. Particle size is also a good indication, but again, like I mentioned earlier, you can see that particle size correlates with this ratio right here. So lipids have been used to detect cardiovascular disease for a while, but if you can put HDL in the denominator of any other lipid, so between total cholesterol, triglycerides, or LDL, if you make a ratio of a cholesterol marker over HDL, then you can see that it shows better results. And the triglyceride to HDL ratio is probably the best one. So triglycerides have also been shown to be significant, but when stratified by HDL, results become even more accurate. Again, I'm just saying the same thing. Triglycerides to HDL ratio is more important than total LDL cholesterol. That's what I'm trying to say here, okay? There were some limitations with this study. Patients were already high risk, only lipids were compared, and they didn't look at certain medications like statins, which could alter the relationships between these lipids, but these findings were still statistically significant. Again, for the last time, nearly all routinely addressed lipid variables were associated with the extent of coronary artery disease, but only the ratio of triglycerides to HDL were robustly associated with the disease extent. Evaluation of the ratio to triglyceride to HDL was the single most powerful predictor of extensive coronary heart disease among all the lipid variables examined, including LDL cholesterol. I said I was going to show you guys another study that proved essentially the same thing, and here it is. This one looked at about 3,000 men versus about 400 people and found the same thing. Men with conventional risk factors for ischemic heart disease have a low risk of ischemic heart disease if they have low triglycerides and high HDL levels. This will skew your triglyceride to HDL ratio to a favorable number that is less than 4. It's studies like this that make people think that LDL is the main risk factor for coronary artery disease. This is a study from 1977. It's a very famous study. It's called the Framingham study. And if you look at LDL compared to coronary artery disease, you can see that there is a pretty clear indication here. What needs to be kept in mind is that this is an epidemiology study. It's not an interventional study like the last one that we looked at. It's simply looking at populations and comparing lipid values to those populations. I borrowed this from Dr. Paul Saladino. For those of you guys who don't know who he is, he's a carnivore doctor. I will mention a couple more of his slides. This specifically was on the Joe Rogan podcast. I got this from him. I wanted to give him credit for it. So when we look at this Framingham study and we compare LDL to cholesterol, we can see this indication like I said. But the second you stratify this by a third variable, what I would consider a marker of metabolic health, like HDL, you can see that when you look at HDL levels compared to LDL and heart disease, the highest HDL values showed the lowest incidence of heart disease, whereas the lowest HDL values showed the highest incidence of heart disease. So this just shows that there's more to it than just LDL. Now, given everything that I just said, why should anybody care about this? Now, up until about June of 2018, I was almost 300 pounds. I was fat, I was unhealthy, I didn't feel good. And then I discovered the ketogenic diet. My life changed. I lost 80 pounds over a period of about 5 months, and I looked and felt great. You can see there's a pretty clear difference here. So I decided at around this point, it was December of 2018, that I wanted to get some blood work done just to make sure that everything looked good. So these were some of my values. I was a little shocked to see my total cholesterol over 300, but there are 3 specific values that I wanted to focus on based off of what we've already covered. So if we look at triglycerides, we can see my triglycerides, okay, they're under 150. That's not bad. You can see my HDL cholesterol, it's greater than 40, so I'd like it to be higher, and I have some ideas as to why it was as low as it is, but I'm not really going to go into that right now. But if we look underneath that, we see this glaring 232 LDL cholesterol. If I walked into any doctor, they would have tried to put me on statins immediately, okay? It's a good thing that this was independent. Now, I would have refused those statins, but I figure it is important for me to measure that because this is personal experience that I've had, and I feel like I would have been mistreated if I would have went to a doctor. So what's even more important is that in this portal, when I click on LDL cholesterol, it pulls up this. Now, what is familial hypercholesterolemia? If we look at the bottom here, it says LDL-C levels greater than or equal to 190 may indicate familial hypercholesterolemia. Why is this important? Familial hypercholesterolemia is a genetic deficiency that affects the LDL receptors on the liver. So basically what happens is you don't have enough receptors on the liver to pull LDL out of the blood, and then it causes a lot of issues. You'll see in people that are very young that have this genetic deficiency, this polymorphism, that they end up developing symptoms of cardiovascular disease at a very young age. For example, my mom and my aunt are twins, and they both have this genetic variant. So when I look at this and I see that I'm being misdiagnosed with familial hypercholesterolemia, knowing that my mom and my aunt both have it, and I have a family history of coronary artery disease, obviously this is going to scare me a little bit. Okay? Now, I'm happy to tell you that I know I don't have it. I got some genetic testing done, whatever. That said, my mom and my aunt have homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia, which means that they have the double gene, so they're even worse off than most people. So if I didn't know that I didn't have this genetic deficiency, should I be concerned? So we're going to go back to the first study, And we're going to look at my lipids versus the study's lipids. You can see that my LDL is high, and this LDL is actually low. The triglycerides are a little higher than I'd like to see, and my HDL is a little lower than I'd like to see, but it's still more favorable than the studies. So you can look and you can see that my ratio is only 2.44, whereas the study's ratio was an average of a 4.36, which is much more indicative of coronary artery disease. So again, according to the study, we found that a triglyceride to HDL ratio greater than 4 is the most powerful independent predictor of coronary artery disease development. So just based off of this number alone, I don't think I have anything to worry about. But I did want to take it a step further. Remember what I said before about stratifying cholesterol numbers by other markers of metabolic health? If we look at this study, it looks at insulin levels versus lipids versus cardiovascular disease. So when you stratify cholesterol levels by hyperinsulinemia, you can see pretty clearly that is an independent risk factor of heart disease, regardless of what triglycerides, HDL, and LDL look like. Of course, that doesn't mean that there isn't an association, as we've seen before, but you can see that hyperinsulinemia is a very major risk factor. Insulin sensitivity, on the other hand, is a marker of metabolic health. Hyperinsulinemia simply just means that you have high insulin levels, and high insulin levels are indicative of things like diabetes, metabolic disorders, etc. Also cardiovascular disease. I'm willing to bet that insulin resistance is probably one of the key factors in most of the modern metabolic diseases that we see today. Even things that you wouldn't think about, like PCOS, has a lot of roots in hyperinsulinemia, in insulin resistance. So now just looking at these graphs real quick, if we look at a fasting insulin of 12, which is not metabolically healthy, it should be around like a 5 max. Versus a fasting insulin level of 15, we can see that across the board, higher your insulin levels are, the more likely you are to develop cardiovascular disease. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't these associations. Like I said, you can see that apolipoprotein B, which is essentially the building blocks for LDL cholesterol, is associated, but you can see that association across all of these cholesterol levels with an insulin level greater than 15. So I've never gotten a fasting insulin test, but when I got this blood work done, I did get some markers tested that may be related to this. So hyperinsulinemia is most often associated with type 2 diabetes. 2 markers that diabetes doctors will look at are your fasting glucose and your hemoglobin A1C. We're going to compare these values to an actual diabetic, like my father, and we're going to see the differences here. You can see I have a fasting glucose of 82. It's right in the range. I think this is a good number, okay? Look at my dad's. My dad's fasting glucose is 169, almost double mine, okay? Then we look at my hemoglobin A1C. I'm well below the 5.71 average range. This is very insulin sensitive, whereas this is not insulin sensitive. This tells me that my dad has hyperinsulinemia, and we know that he does because he's a diabetic and he's being treated for it. So my numbers are not indicative of hyperinsulinemia, and his numbers are. So if my triglyceride to HDL ratio is low, and I am insulin sensitive, I think it's pretty fair to assume that I'm probably not developing cardiovascular disease. But why does this matter? I'm in a bunch of keto groups on Facebook, okay? It's very common that you'll see changes in your cholesterol when you go on keto. And I did just want to read this real quick and go through it and kind of dissect it. Well, bad news for my cholesterol. I've been on keto for 5 months and it's working great for blood sugar, but my cholesterol has increased to 287 and now 330. Triglycerides are good, 99. HDL is good, 84, but my LDL is 226. I rely on olive oil a lot. I eat nuts, avocados. I do eat eggs every morning, and I eat full-fat cheese almost every day. I eat some butter, processed meats like salami, cream cheese, 85-15 hamburger. Do you think I should go on a statin as my doctor wants me to, or just reduce my saturated fat? My argument here is that I don't think this person should do either. Because if we look at their triglyceride to HDL ratio, you can see this number is very favorable. They're diabetic. They saw improvements in their blood sugar. I'm sure if they saw their A1C, they'd probably see improvements in their A1C. And if you look at this triglyceride to HDL ratio, it's only 1.18. Why do we care about this LDL cholesterol of 226? This is a nice whole foods diet. Olive oil, nuts, avocados, eggs, full fat cheese. Some of you guys may think that processed meats like salami, might be causing this issue, but I don't think that really matters. I think that I think that it's pretty clear that the triglyceride to HDL ratio and the fact that this person is seeing improvements in their blood sugar, I think that that's enough to tell me that this person is not metabolically unhealthy. Now we're going to look at this person on the right here, and we're going to see the same thing. Can anyone help me understand my cholesterol? So I started keto last August, lost 36 pounds, lowered my A1C, been off my diabetes meds, and stopped my statin. And now my cholesterol levels, specifically my LDL cholesterols, have shot up. So these numbers are in metric, but it doesn't matter, because if you can still take them and you can still do an LDL to or you can still do a triglyceride to HDL ratio. You can see this person has a triglyceride to HDL ratio of lower than 1, 0.92. Lost 36 pounds. They lowered their A1C. They're off of their diabetics medication. Why on earth would these people be developing cardiovascular disease? It makes absolutely no sense to me. But then they go to their doctor and they show them all of these amazing benefits that they're having from this diet, from losing all this weight. And all they can do is myopically look at their LDL cholesterol and then prescribe them to a drug that I would argue that they probably don't even need. All of these people on here, I can't even tell you, I see these posts every day. All of these people on here talking about how they've seen improvements in their A1C, improvements in their blood sugar, they're off their diabetes medications, they lost all this weight. Yet their doctors look at their cholesterol and they want to put them on statins because they think that somehow they're going to start developing cardiovascular disease, even though they're more insulin sensitive and their triglyceride to HDL ratios are perfectly fine. This is super important because these people have no idea that they're being mistreated, and the doctors don't understand that they are probably mistreating these patients. I think it's very important that we look at something called context. Context is everything. We don't just want to myopically look at one single marker and then decide this person's fate for the rest of their lives that they need to be on cholesterol medication. Now, this is Dr. Paul Saladino. I mentioned him earlier. He's a full-blown carnivore. He eats animals nose to tail. The only carbohydrate he really consumes is honey. He doesn't really eat plants at all. He's 43 years old. His father had an early heart attack at the age of 43, so this is important to keep in mind. After getting his blood work done, his total cholesterol was somewhere around 650. His HDL was over 80, which is a great number, and his LDL cholesterol was 533, which is insane. This is like numbers that you would see in people with familial hypercholesterolemia. So any doctor looking at this blood work right now would be losing their minds and telling him that he would be basically having a heart attack before he walked out of the office. But what's important here is that he got himself a coronary artery calcium scan, which is essentially one of the most accurate tests that you can do for atherosclerosis, arterial plaque formation, and he got a score back of 0. So at the same age that his father had his first heart attack, you can see this man's LDL cholesterol is insanely high, but because he's very insulin sensitive, because he follows a low carb diet, these cholesterol numbers should not be as important as somebody who is insulin resistant, as somebody who is eating a standard American diet with a lot of seed oils and a lot of sugar. So there are just 3 more studies that I wanted to power through here real quick. Thanks for sticking with me, and I think that these are going to be some of the most compelling studies on top of everything that I've already said. So these next 2 studies I borrowed from Dr. Nadir Ali's talk from Low Carb Under in 2019. You can actually find that video on YouTube. He is a interventional cardiologist who treats people specifically with heart disease, and he's been doing this for over 25 years. And in the last decade or so, he has started implementing nutritional interventions rather than using pharmaceutical interventions, and he has seen drastic improvements in his patients. What I wanted to share from him was this study called the Leiden 85 Plus study. It looked at 724 patients, and it compared their cholesterol values to all-cause mortality and respiratory infection death rates. And you can see that the people with the lowest levels of cholesterol had the highest levels of death, all-cause mortality, and respiratory infection, whereas the people with the highest cholesterol levels saw the lowest levels of all-cause mortality and respiratory infection. Cholesterol is important it's very protective. It's not something that we should just be trying to lower all the time because we have this misguided notion that cholesterol is bad for us. It's not. It serves so many vital functions in the body, from transporting lipids to being the backbone of androgens like testosterone. It makes us who we are. This is another study from Dr. Nadir Ali called the Lothian birth cohort that did essentially the same thing. It looked at 1,078 patients, and it compared their levels of hypertension, stroke, and cardiovascular disease to their cholesterol levels. And you can see those with the highest level of cholesterol had the lowest risk of hypertension, the lowest risk of stroke, and the lowest risk of cardiovascular disease. While those with low cholesterol were much more likely to experience hypertension, have a stroke, or coronary artery disease. The same study also looked at cognitive abilities of these people and found that in the lowest cholesterol groups, general ability, processing speed, and memory was much lower than those in the higher cholesterol groups. And for the people on statins, they found that those people's general ability, processing speed, and memory was even lower than those that were not on statins. So again, cholesterol is very important. It's important for mental function. It's important for hormonal function. It's very protective. It's a good thing. We shouldn't be bastardizing this. Now, this is the last study, and I think that this is probably one of the best studies to show here, because this one literally just like, it doesn't get any clearer than this. This is an actual interventional study. It looked at patients that had already suffered from a heart attack and wanted to see how likely they were to suffer from another one. So they wanted to see how likely recurrence was. And they used dietary interventions. Polyunsaturated fat, specifically linoleic acid, is one of the main components in the oils that we see that the American Heart Association considers heart healthy. Corn oil, safflower oil, soy oil, these oils are very high in linoleic acid. They're very high in polyunsaturated fats. And these are the oils that your doctor is recommending that you eat. So in this interventional study, in the intervention group versus the control group, they increased their polyunsaturated fat intake by 2.2%. They decreased their saturated fat by 2.1%. Saturated fat, this is the bad fat that we see people always talking about, how it's going to raise your cholesterol. But if cholesterol isn't the cause of heart disease, why does this matter? What they ultimately found was that with this intervention, it actually decreased their cholesterol levels by 108 points. This is pretty significant. This is a pretty significant decrease. So even though they gave these people oils that clearly lowered their cholesterol, what do you think happened in the interventional group versus the control group? There were higher rates of mortality in those that had the lower cholesterol groups. They were much more likely to die from all causes, they were much more likely to die from cardiovascular disease, and they were much more likely to die from coronary heart disease, which is, these two are kind of interchangeable, but whatever. Cholesterol is not the main cause of heart disease. I think I've made it pretty clear here, and there's a ton of other research that I could go into that explains this further, but if you just take a look at interventional studies, not epidemiological studies that show associations, but interventional studies that actually prove 100%, you can see from the second that this intervention started, this graph splits off very clearly. There's no overlap here. There's no overlap in any one of these graphs. The second these interventions started was the second that these rates of risk increased in these patients. It doesn't get any clearer than that. Now, I'm sure that there will be people that can argue against this, and I welcome that, but I think it's important to know the other side of the story here, and I think it's important to understand that context is the key. If there's anything that you get from this entire thing, context is key when you're looking at lipids, but also any other markers of metabolic health. So again, my name is Chris Megenbeer. Thanks for watching my video.